Welcome to our latest episode of Wellbeing Wednesdays, the National Council's virtual series on healthcare. In this episode, National Council for Mental Wellbeing President and CEO Chuck Ingoglia is joined by former Congressman Patrick Kennedy, founder of the Kennedy Forum. In our new episode, Mr. Kennedy will share his thoughts on his new book, Profiles in Mental Health Courage, the personal narratives that shape the book, and his work at the Kennedy Forum to raise awareness about mental health. Now, please welcome National Council CEO Chuck Ingoglia.
Hello and welcome to this issue of Wellbeing Wednesday. And what a treat we have in store for you today. It's hard to imagine that our field, community mental health, is really only 60 years old. Isn't that hard to believe? You know, it was just 60 years ago that President Kennedy signed into law legislation that allowed the federal government to pay for the construction of community mental health centers. And that really set off a whole new movement in this country, this notion that people with mental illness and addiction could be treated in their communities, close to their families and their friends, close to social supports, and not needing to be in institutions. It hasn't always gone great, has it, right? As a country, we've had lots of ups and downs, but certainly COVID, I think, has reminded everyone that mental illness and addiction is real, it's common, it's treatable, people can and do recover. And what a thrill to be joined today by Patrick J. Kennedy, former congressman from Rhode Island, but don't forget the former. He is a current mental health and substance use advocate. He is somebody who's all in on trying to use his personal voice and experience to improve care. And we're so excited to have Patrick with us and to be able to discuss his new book, Profiles in Mental Health Courage. Patrick, thank you for being here.
Oh, Chuck, always great to be with you.
So listen, in your new book, Profiles in Mental Health Courage, you try to really tap into the experience of real people. But I loved how in your introduction, you tried to remind all of us, right, this isn't new stuff. That throughout history, great people in this country have struggled with mental illness and addiction. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the characters you highlight in your intro to help put this in perspective for us?
Sure. So obviously, for people who are old enough to remember John F. Kennedy's Profiles in Courage book, you know, he featured 8 U.S. senators who demonstrated courage in overcoming their parochial and local interests to support the national interest. And, you know, I obviously love that title, Profiles in Courage. I know that today we, at a contemporary moment of major public health and addiction crisis, we need people to be courageous and show how they're struggling, because if we're not aware of how these illnesses manifest and how they really affect people in their daily lives, we're not going to be that good at meeting their needs. But to your point, Chuck, in the intro, I found out that of those that I can document, half of those senators that President Kennedy used in his book were people who had been affected by mental illness and addiction in profound ways. So my late father, Senator Kennedy, was a big fan of Daniel Webster. Well, Daniel Webster died of cirrhosis of the liver. So he was known actively as someone who suffered from the disease of alcoholism. Sam Houston, first president of Texas, then U.S. Senator from Texas, was known and disparaged as the quote unquote big drunk. You had Lucius Lamar, another senator featured in President Kennedy's book, who watched his father take his life in front of their house with a gun. You had, of course, John Quincy Adams, the son of the other President Adams, lost his two brothers to alcoholism within their 30s, and lost his eldest son to suicide at age 28. So just these are the ones that we can document. It's really striking when you think about the degree to which they were suffering. And of course, none of that was mentioned in any of their biographies per se. But without a whole lot of digging, we realize that even our quote unquote founding fathers were impacted by these illnesses. We obviously, as you know, Chuck, have a greater appreciation for these illnesses now post-COVID. But the point of obviously mentioning all of those is that obviously this is not a new set of issues. But what is new is the recognition that these are major impacts on our society, and we can't go along as business as usual, kind of ignoring that these are major factors in everyone's life.
Yeah. What strikes me, Patrick, is I'm just listening to even you tell the story, that these were still great people, right? They were able to live with these illnesses and do great things. And I think that's maybe a story that we don't always hear, right? It's this notion that if you have a mental illness or a substance use, it's almost kind of like a death sentence, right? We all hope is lost. And that's just something that struck me as I was listening to you.
Yeah, in the book, Profiles of Mental Health Courage, you see everybody struggling, but it's sometimes more successfully than others, but they're still making it, some barely, but it really is courageous the way they're fighting. When someone has cancer, we say, they're so courageous, they're fighting cancer. But with mental illness and addiction, we don't have that view. We kind of look at it as a personal character flaw on the part of people, that they would somehow live on the street voluntarily, subject themselves to the justice system because they're constantly being arrested, end up alienating their family, living homeless, getting fired from jobs. I mean, these are not things people choose in their lives. And yet, as a society, we still put this huge judgment on people who are living with these illnesses because we don't understand the symptoms. And part of the reason I wrote this book is that I want to distinguish between the illnesses and the people. The people are tremendous people. You can really differentiate between the two when actually people are more transparent. You kind of feel like, oh my God, I don't want to tell everybody that. But ironically, the more we tell, the more freeing it is for us who talk about it, but the more transparent it is that the illness is this and we're this. We're people with the illness. And in the book, I talk to spouses, I talk to kids, siblings, coworkers, in addition to their treating physicians and therapists. So what we often miss, Chuck, is the multidimensional part of these illnesses. First of all, because those of us who tell our stories often just tell it from a very sanitized, self-edited kind of memoir. We often leave out kind of what everyone else thinks of us and how they actually see us. And as you know, one of the main characteristics of these illnesses is a lack of insight into your own illness. So in many respects, writing about our lives with these illnesses is distorted just because we don't always remember things as they really are. I mean, that's the function of the illness. So in this book, Profiles of Mental Health Courage, I make a very intentional point of bringing in the whole family, so to speak, both biological and chosen, because it's really important for our country to know this isn't 1 in 4, Chuck. This is 1 in 1, because these illnesses obviously are affecting the person with the diagnosis, but obviously they're affecting everyone around them. And I think we need to get that perspective out there, Chuck, because That is why we need people's support, not because they necessarily can overcome their implicit bias that they don't like those people with addiction, but they can't ignore the fact that these affect them in their daily lives in really big ways because they work alongside someone with these illnesses. Their kids are suffering, their spouse is suffering, and so forth.
Well, I think that's a premise of a lot of the public education work that we do, right? Is that most of us are likely to encounter someone who has a mental illness or substance use disorder, and how do we then show up as good partners? But Patrick, I want to maybe I'll take a deviation from this book and to maybe this is really a follow up to your first book, right? Where you told your story. Why did you think it was necessary to follow up with this book after what you had done before?
Well, I have to say, my co-writer, Stephen Fried, who's a professor of journalism at Columbia, is just a brilliant, brilliant writer on mental health subjects. He's done so his whole life. There's often not a really awareness about how to cover these illnesses, and other than a kind of pejorative way that you often see in a People magazine, National Enquirer type approach. And we need journalists. Thank God for Rosalind Carter and all the work that the Carter Center has done to try to educate journalists on how to cover these issues, so that we don't add to the existing stigma in the way that we portray these illnesses. So Stephen did a terrific job. I have to tell you, I was terrified throughout the whole thing because he asked for my medical records. We actually went and interviewed my former therapist. We went and interviewed your colleagues, Chuck, who used to come up and lobby me on the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act. And of course, they were terrified to tell me how much I was struggling and their real views of things. They said to me, they'd walk out of a briefing in my office and all roll their eyes and say, Patrick needs to get help. But of course, between them and everyone else, I was a congressman, so people couldn't often feel comfortable telling me, how they thought I was really suffering. And frankly, that's still the case. Part of the reason I write this book is that we have to be more transparent in not feeling as if we're encroaching on people's, quote, personal business by asking them how they are, talking about it openly. In the book, I feature a lot of different people with that narrative kind of woven into it. My cousin, Mark McMurray, on my mom's side, lost his son to suicide. And, I speak to him. First time, by the way, he's spoken about his son's loss in the 7 years since he lost his son, Harry, at 22, which tells you a lot about, this epidemic of suicide. There's going to be a bow wave of continued trauma, especially if people who've suffered this don't themselves get help. And Mark has never, talked about it. Of course, his other son, never talked about it. And Mark never talked to his other son about the loss of his brother. And of course, neither one of them had talked to Harry's roommate in college. And what's really striking is how much they're all surprised by what they don't know that the other knows. So Belton can't believe what Mark knows. Mark can't believe what Belton knows. Mark can't believe what Harry's roommate in college knows. The point is that we don't talk about these illnesses. So maybe if they had all shared because they weren't worried about talking behind Harry's back, maybe they would have had a more fuller, realistic picture of what Harry was going through. And you can't say, but perhaps they would have taken a different approach to how they responded to Harry. So the loss that we're experiencing out there from both addiction and suicide could probably, pretty safely to say, be mitigated if all of us were able to understand these illnesses, certainly not encumbered in our ability to talk about them openly, and ask questions and not feel like we're stepping on people's toes by being legitimately concerned about their health. I mean, when it came to cancer, we talk about are they doing better? How's the chemo going? But in mental health, we don't know what the chemo is. We don't know what the radiation. We don't know what the equivalence of all of this is. And you don't have to have cancer to know what that cancer treatment looks like. But in mental health, the average person, when they say they're getting treatment, has no idea what that means. And we need to have the general public know more about these illnesses, especially if we're going to be comprehensive in our approach. And Chuck, back to the community mental health, I mean, CCBHCs and a community approach illustrate that we need a multi-pronged approach, meaning everyone needs to be in on this. And that's why we need to educate the total population, not just the kind of medical professionals and providers who, by the way, need to be upskilled and many times their own skill sets to treat particular types of diagnosis, but all of us. This belongs to all of us, not just people like you and I who are in the quote movement.
Yeah. Yeah, it strikes me, that our members, people who run agencies treating mental health and substance use, they might not be surprised by some of the stories that you include in your book because the stories are messy, right? They're complex. They're not straightforward. Why did you choose to, you have a really broad range of folks that you included, and what were some of the messages you were hoping to convey?
Well, as you know, Chuck, when Jim Ramstad, my Republican colleague, and I wrote the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, we wanted to try to capture the medical equivalent for mental health and addiction so that we could get money into the system. And the system understands services. The system understands services and money tied to diagnostics. But all of us who are, familiar with these illnesses know that there's another component entirely, kind of the social supports, the mental health supports, frankly, the spiritual connection you get from being in a community. Now, those things aren't reimbursable in our medical system, but we had to do what we could to put the liability on insurance companies to pay for these things the way they would other medical specialties. Now we're at a moment where we can get them to ideally change the reimbursement system because they'll realize that social supports actually produces outcomes like a new drug. And that, mental health services, when delivered with the latest evidence-based cognitive behavioral therapy, really can produce better outcomes and so forth and so on. So what I'm hoping is that people understand that we did what we had to do with medical for the parity law so we could get money in the system. But now that we're getting the money in the system, we have to spend it in that biopsychosocial way that traditionally we have not reimbursed for in the mental health system. But, I wrote about the fact that these are messy illnesses to highlight, the fact that in reality, if you had been able to support people in these other ways, that perhaps they would not have had the difficulties that they had because we are fixated, Chuck, on the medical angle. And yes, we need the medical approach, but that's just one leg of the stool. And part of the reason we don't get those optimal outcomes is that it's a three-legged stool. And if you're not including the mental health and you're not including the social supports, that's going to fall down every time. And we need a more nuanced approach for these illnesses and a more comprehensive approach than what we're traditionally reimbursing for.
So, Patrick, I remember when Charlie Curie was administrator of SAMHSA during the second Bush presidency, and he had a whole push around co-occurring disorders. And you would have thought he was asking people to eat peas for dessert because there were lots of folks who really didn't like this idea of focusing on co-occurring disorders. But in your book, Profiles of Mental Health Courage, you really underscore the connection between mental health and substance use. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's so clear to all of us that what creates these distinctions are funding streams, are regulations, are bureaucracies. And we have whole cottage industries and treatment systems because of the funding that arise out of those siloed reimbursement streams. The beauty about the certified community behavioral health centers is you're finally talking about breaking down those artificial barriers and treating people kind of on a continuum We also don't, as a society, think about mental health and mental well-being as part of the overall continuum of care, because we're fixated, as we should with a certain level of urgency, on those with medical diagnoses whose mental illness is really disabling, compromising their real agency and effectiveness in living their lives. But what we need to do is build kind of that broader understanding that mental health is everybody. We all have times in our lives that we're challenged. Some of us have those times that are difficult become clinical in terms of the level of disability that they create. But having that greater kind of overall approach will keep us from kind of reacting in too narrow a way, like we're checking the box on if you fit this perfect profile, then we know what to do with you. No, we just need to take care of each other.
Yeah.
No one wants to spend their life getting therapy, getting, this. They want to live their life with their family, be productive at work, be in their community. It's not as if people are accessing services for the sake of accessing services. When they do need services, we can't be over kind of deciding like, are they legitimate? Are they somehow gaming the system? I don't know a single person who's spending their days trying to access services that they
I
don't
mean,
need.
like, wouldn't you
Yeah.
rather go to the community mental health center on Friday than go bowling? I mean, come on.
But Chuck, I mean, unfortunately, insurance companies have traditionally
Oh, I
viewed
know.
this as whether they deserve to get access where they really, really need it. And part of the problem is, instead of doing all that pre-auth, if we treated people right away, then we could mitigate the downstream impacts of really denying care and then waiting for it to become a stage 4 illness before we even intervene, so that it rises, quote unquote, to a certain clinical level of disability, as opposed to meeting people where they are and treating them. Oh, it's a mental health. Oh, I don't cover that. Go down the hall to get, addiction treatment, which reimburse differently. No, as in the case
Yeah.
with the CBHCs, they're all put
Yeah.
together as it should
Well,
be
I
generally.
mean, if we think about chronic illness in general, right? If you have any chronic illness, you are much more likely to have anxiety or depression. Substance use is a chronic illness. So why should we expect anything different with substance use than we experience with cancer, hypertension, diabetes, etc.? Right? We should expect the same. And to your other point, Patrick, I wholeheartedly agree. I think as a society and as systems, we need to have more of a treatment first kind of perspective. You're focusing a lot on, kind of the insurance side, but on the publicly financed side too, we have the system that puts up so many roadblocks to people actually getting care. You have to fill out so much paperwork before anybody can talk to you about what's actually bringing you in for that day. And I'm really hoping we can turn that model on its head. What strikes me, and I think about your book, is this is a great book for everybody to read, to try to really get rooted in understanding, raising your own kind of self-awareness around mental health and substance use. What are you hoping people will do after they read the book?
Well, obviously, I'm a policy wonk by trade and politician by practice. I have found, Chuck, that, as you know from years on the Hill, that we don't have a really well-developed advocacy community. And we certainly need to have a much more pronounced advocacy movement commensurate with the demands of our country on so many levels, none the least of which is the escalating suicide and overdose rates. So, and the levels of disability really from every stretch of society and demographic group. So we need to build a system. Now, your systems of CCBHCs are beginning to show and demonstrate the model of comprehensive care. But we all know we need to have an infrastructure bill, just like we have, $1 trillion roads and bridges infrastructure. We need to bring information technology out to the mental health world in a way that it isn't today. 90% of the practitioners of mental health are not connected to any electronic health record. What that means is, back to your point about kind of other chronic comorbidities, we're not tying, their treatment to cancer to their mental health and depression, anxiety treatment. We're not doing depression, which is 4 times more likely to increase your risk of heart attack if you're treating someone with cardiovascular disease. We're not weaving in the diabetes care to drug treatment, because if you're drinking, your diabetes is not going to get better. So the point is, we need to finally really integrate this into overall healthcare, and we need to build the infrastructure to do that. We don't have the pipeline of workers, hence, we're having to borrow from Peter to pay Paul. We have every system from the private sector to the public sector all fighting for the same workforce, instead of us joining together to put together a national plan to increase the pipeline of mental health and addiction clinicians. That's a political challenge, Chuck. That's not, we know how to do that, but we need people to, do it. And frankly, Chuck, my wife, as you know, ran for Congress a couple of years ago. I could get 100 bricklayers or iron workers or sheet metal workers or, laborers or, teachers together to do an event for my wife. At the drop of a hat, I just called the local and said, I need people at this place at this time. And they said, how many do you need? And in mental health and addiction, we're not together when it comes to really lighting up these congressional districts, lighting up the states, lighting up the state legislator districts and municipal and county election, so that when someone's running for office at any level of government, they're able to look at their constituents and say, oh my God, look at how many people vote for mental health in my constituency. If they had the feeling that I had as a Democratic lawmaker when it came to labor, they'd say, Patrick, you need a jump. And I'd say, how high, right? Because they held the key to my elections. And of course, with the environment, same thing. With so many other issues, we need to deploy the same political science that other, quote, special interest groups deploy. We need to do it on behalf of our issues. Because yes, we're getting more than we ever did, Chuck. But I'd say when truth comes out, we need to do this in a way much more consequential, much more fulsome than we have today.
Right. I couldn't agree more. And Patrick, at the back of your book, Profiles of Mental Health Courage, you have a little QR code. And what does that lead one to?
Well, Chuck, thanks for, helping really pull together the whole community, because we all win when any one of us wins. We're all in it together. And we need to break down those silos. Obviously, we have to align ourselves, much like CCBHC's aligned to the outcomes. We're not just looking for services to check. We want outcomes, real people's lives, which means we have to provide housing and, supportive employment and supportive living and all the med management and therapy. All of that has to be aligned so that you're not just getting one piece of the, pie, but we're losing other pieces because they're not fully funded adequately to complement the medical side. So back to the original point. So we need an alignment for progress. To make progress in this country, we need the financial reimbursement systems to reward outcomes, not just services. That's a profound change in outlook within our whole community. And I'm so proud that we have all of our CEO Alliance, part of this alignment, and this idea just taken out of HIV AIDS, 90, 90, 90 by 2033. So that's what the HIV, they were determined to get the medication expedited, to get the therapy, to get the screening. And we need to do the same for our movement. So 90% screened. I mean, how do we treat cancer at stage 1? We should be doing the same with mental health and addiction. Universal screening, not, let's aim for 90%. 90% getting evidence-based treatment. I mean, we wouldn't imagine not providing evidence-based interventions to cancer, cardiovascular disease, and 90% supported in chronic care management, which for us means the social supports and supportive living and employment services. We know what to do. We need to demand the same overarching goals that other areas of medicine have demonstrated they can do if they're politically motivated. And that begins with us being better organized. So in the back of the books, like you said, Chuck, we have a QR code. So if people read the book and they want to have an idea, well, how does this all piece together? It looks like this profile, was homeless because they didn't get a lot of supportive housing. And this profile didn't get comprehensive care because the information technology was not there to cross state lines. So the system didn't talk, even within a given municipality, the ER here didn't talk to the treatment place over here. All of this kind of lends itself to understanding why the policy needs to be changed, because you're seeing people's lives just fall through the cracks where they don't need to fall through the cracks. And that's why in the back, we give people kind of a directory of possible policies. And as you know, Chuck, we're just playing catch up overall in this issue. So we have a really 1.0. So I encourage people who do go on the QR code, if they have ideas, talk to you. You're putting together such a great back room. And frankly, our policy guide relies on input from organizations like yours to make sure it's up to date.
Well, and we're so happy to be able to partner with you in the Kennedy Forum to move this forward. So, Patrick, maybe I want to go back to, again, when I'm thinking about the stories in your book, one of the things that struck me in the profiles, maybe as a kind of an undercurrent to so many of the stories, is the role of trauma. And just wondering your own reflections on trauma and its impact on mental health and substance use, and then what more can we do to try to address that?
Yeah, well, as you know from many of the stories, I mean, Miss Tony Dreyer, she, saw her brother killed. She was, part of a big family. She was left to supervise her younger siblings at a premature age herself, and one of her siblings was hit by a car. How could you blame her for never being the same? You see a lot of these profiles grow up in homes like the adverse childhood experience studies tell us, if you've had these, characteristics in your life, poverty, grow up with domestic violence at home, a spouse that's suffering from a mental illness addiction on themselves, a parent that's suffering from this, poverty, and someone in the justice involved system, particularly if it's a parent, you're trying to grow up in this environment. There's not a direct correlation, but if you have enough of these risk factors,
Sure.
there's a pretty high kind of probability that you're going to end up with needing, interventions yourself. And why shouldn't you be? We're all impacted by our environment. So I think obviously we have to have a public health system. We can't just be treating our way entirely out of this epidemic. We have to, part of our plan has to be a much more proactive approach, which means we have to reach kids. They are, where are the kids? They're in schools. What does that mean? That means we need to put, behavioral health in the schools, especially given the epidemic of mental health and addiction challenges amongst our youth and the struggles that they have. We have to empower parents to better understand how to help their kids. They don't just get the handbook in life as to how to be supportive. We just need greater literacy overall. And and understanding trauma, also understanding how to best treat trauma, like best treat all illnesses, we need to deploy those evidence-based interventions that we know actually mitigate impact of trauma on people's lives as opposed to exacerbate the trauma, because the treatments are only kind of repeating the trauma or reinforcing the trauma as opposed to giving people the skills to work the way through the trauma. And that requires a major, as you know, transformation within our delivery system and our training that goes into training therapists to better treat these illnesses. That's why trauma informed, and I know you guys do so much on the way of trying to bring greater awareness and literacy to trauma informed care.
Couldn't agree more. And I think it's trauma informed, but then also, as you point out, we also have to have trauma specific interventions to
Yes.
make sure people can heal and get better. Well, Patrick, thank you so much. It's a pleasure spending time with you. And on behalf of everyone who cares about people with mental illness and substance use, our members who provide treatment, we're just so grateful for your continued advocacy. Any final thoughts as we wrap up here?
Yeah, I would not be able to join you today, Chuck, if it weren't for all the help that I got. And I was in drug treatment many times. I was on medication assisted treatment for buprenorphine. I had therapists. So all I'm saying is the people who treat these illnesses are angels, because honestly, the symptoms of these illnesses are so often very antisocial. So when you're actually leaning in and helping someone, it's more challenging than any other area of healthcare, because the people you're trying to help are the most resistant to help. Unlike other areas of medicine where they're wrapping their arms around you because you're helping them. So there's a special type of person that provides care. I want to acknowledge them. I have 5 kids and an incredible spouse. They have not had to see me under the influence of drugs and alcohol. And it's a direct result of a lot of folks over time who the cumulative impact is that I have a new lease on life thanks to them. So my thanks go out to your members, Chuck, who spend their lives trying to help people just like me recover.
Well, I appreciate that, Patrick. I was just out in Long Island visiting a member last week, and I'm always just so inspired by the heart and commitment and the bravery they have to exhibit, right? They're fighting against all these regulatory burdens, payment burdens, but at the root of it, they're trying to figure out how can we make our communities healthy and strong. And I appreciate your shout out to them, and we're just so grateful for all the work that they do.
Well, we need to
Well,
make sure they get paid, as you and I both know, because they're the worst paid in our healthcare system. And there's no wonder there aren't enough of them. We have to have people be able to earn a living, provide for their own families, or else we're not going to have the workforce we need to be able to meet the challenges of our
yeah, and
country.
Patrick, you've done a great job of bringing up CCBHCs, Certified Community Behavioral Health Clinics, several times. And so much of what we're trying to do in that movement is we've talked about center what's clinically needed as opposed to what do we have money for, right? We historically, right? It's like, what can we afford as opposed to what's needed. So let's start with evidence-based. Let's start with team-based care. Let's start with thinking about people as whole people. And then let's, at the end of the day, make sure we have sufficient reimbursement. So that's going to be one leg of the stool. The work that we're doing around parity enforcement. And I think we're at a really interesting inflection point around parity. But I agree with you. All these things have to come together so that it's easier to make people get the treatment, care, and support that they need.
Thanks so much, Chuck.
All right. Well, this concludes our episode of Wellbeing Wednesday. My huge thanks to Patrick Kennedy for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion. Thank you all, and be well.